Eye on the Storm, Hurricane Season 2019.
Hey, good evening. I'm meteorologist Bill Ray. Welcome to Eye on the Storm, your weekly in-depth look at the tropics and how it'll impact you. I'm CBS 17 meteorologist Bill Ray in Raleigh, North Carolina. But tonight we've got a great show as I'll be joined by meteorologists in New Haven, Connecticut, excuse me, in the Tri-Cities, Tennessee, as we take a look at some of the inland effects of hurricanes in our mountains and in the Tennessee mountains. Hey, and if there's anything you'd like to know or subject you'd like us to talk about tonight or in the coming weeks, please email us at sendit@cbs17.com. Our digital team is monitoring the email address, so let us hear from you. You can also find us on social media. You see the big graphic right up there. You can reach out to me, to Joe, to Mark, if you have any questions, and I'll be more than happy to talk to you about them. So let's just jump right in now and see what's going on right now as we take a current look at the tropics. I'm going to pull out my little button here, and we're going to move on to show you that we do have something to talk about. You know, for the first few months, it was really hard-pressed to find something, but we're getting in that time of the year when things are starting to get busy. So you've got this little X down here in the eastern part of Cuba that has a slight chance of forming. As a matter of fact, the National Hurricane Center only gives it a 10% chance of development somewhere off the East Coast. And what they're thinking is this area of disturbed showers and storms will drift to the north, and there's a possibility that something could develop, but if you flip that around, you'd say 90% chance nothing's going to develop. We're going to have a cold front coming down, stalling out over us, and the flow was going to take this thing, if anything does develop, and keep it out to sea anyway. But we'll keep an eye on that. Cuba's definitely getting a lot of showers and thunderstorms. We'll talk more about why we don't think that's going to develop, but look at this. This area's just been moved into red. It's this low, let me move on over here. It's this low pressure system marked by an X, and you see the showers and storms out ahead of it. 70% now chance of development, not today or tonight, but sometime in the next 5 days, and in this area right here, well out to the east. So it's going to be drifting west-northwest or moving west-northwest. And when it gets into this part of the Atlantic Ocean, and there's the Caribbean Sea and all the Windward and Leeward Islands, you can see they think something is going to develop. It could be our third storm of the season coming up maybe this weekend. So we've got to really look at that. But let's look at the water vapor right now. The black is dry on this particular map, and you can see some dry up to the northeast, but where those showers and storms, very moist, juicy atmosphere over Cuba, and as that drifts to the north, that's why they're keeping an eye on it just in case, because there's a lot of moisture to work with there. And then you see the dry up to the north, that's the Bermuda High, and also this shaft of dry air right here. And you know, this area of low pressure that's out over here is going to be drifting into that dry air, but then it might pick up some of that moisture, and this will probably shift a little bit, and this will start to close in. But right now it's dry, but we're keeping an eye on that low. But let's go back to this little system right here. You can see the satellite. You can see all the tall clouds here. We're not showing you the radar. We're showing you the tall clouds, but chances are it is pouring in eastern Cuba, and this is what's going to drift to the northwest. These little wiggly lines here, these are the mid-level wind shear. Put it this way, if you see a lot together, there's wind shear. If you don't see anything, there's no wind shear. And you've heard the old thing, the whole theory that, well, it's not a theory, it's a fact that wind shear can try to decrease the development of storms. So what we're thinking about is this little low pressure system, as it does move into this area, there's a lot of wind shear up there. And that's one reason the National Hurricane Center doesn't think it's going to develop off the coast of Florida. This is the mid-level steering currents, the line. So any low pressure is going to follow in between these lines. So it does follow that path that it is going to go to the northeast and then probably curve to the northwest and probably curve to the northeast. This shows you the tropical heat potential, and there's a lot of it down here, and you can see it kind of thumbing itself up into the Bahamas. So there's potential for heat, and definitely the waters are warm enough, 86-degree water temperature. But I think with that shear and this disorganized showers and storms, when it does drift to the north, it's just going to produce a lot of rain off the coast of Florida and stay out to the east of us as it moves up, maybe as a low pressure system, but probably not anything tropical. All right, this area of low pressure, though, looks a little more interesting. There's a lot of shear around it right now as we're showing you the mid-level shear again, but look out in this area. There's no shear at all. So once again, what we're thinking is this area is going to drift away from the shear, and that will allow it to maybe develop vertically and stronger and maybe get some kind of circulation going. The mid-level steering currents, not too distinguished. It's just going to kind of follow this path right here. And the heat potential is definitely there. Here's South America. You can see all the heat potential that it's going to be running into, and the water temperatures running around 84, 83. You know, at home, we've always said you got to have 80-degree water temperature. We definitely have it with that potential system. So we're going to keep an eye on that. But it is July 31st, and so what I want to talk about now, change gears a little bit. Where are the normal formation areas in August? And I think I read that we get like 27% of all our storms in August. It does peak in September with over 33, but we're going to start to ramp things up. For about the third month in a row, the Gulf of Mexico is is a common area where we'll get some tropical storms forming, and you can see that when they do, they'll either go into Texas or up into the Panhandle and the mid-Gulf coast. Number two is this area was around in July too in the Western Caribbean. If something develops there, it kind of goes into the Gulf of Mexico, and then we're back to area one. But here's what's different between July, which had a little area off the Bahamas, and August. Look at this large area, number three, that goes basically from the Bahamas all the way out through the central Atlantic Ocean, where you get those little disturbances coming off of Africa. We're starting to see that now, so that is different than the first 2 months as we get more ramped up in the season, and you can see everything moving where the storms would normally follow. So as we keep an eye on that low pressure system, it's right in an area that normally develops in August, and if it does develop, it will already be August coming up this weekend and the beginning of next week, and it'll be right in the heart of that area, and then we'll have to keep an eye on it. If it does develop, is it going to go up toward the North America coast, curve out to sea? It'll all depend on the high pressure, the Bermuda High, or will it be forced down to the south? I think this is the least likely one for that little disturbance out there. So let's change gears, because we do have a couple storms to talk about in the Pacific. Flossie and Eric. Eric is a hurricane. Flossie is a tropical storm. By the way, here's Baja California, California up here, Mexico, Florida. You can kind of get a perspective. By the way, there's another area they're watching. See that little X? They got a 50% chance of development of that turning into something. So much more active. First of all, Eric, it looks like it's close to Hawaii. And you're like, uh-oh. Well, you know what? Hawaii is okay on this one, because this storm is going to follow and go mostly west. And as a matter of fact, the tracking of it, there it sits, and there are all the Hawaiian Islands. It should stay to the south and weaken from a Category 3 to tropical storm Friday when it passes south of the Big Island. Now, they're going to have large swells there, but they're not going to get a direct impact on this storm, and then it degenerates out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It is moving west-northwest at 14 miles per hour, and winds are 115 miles per hour. So that is Hurricane Eric. Flossie, on the other hand, is a little more interesting, at least for Hawaii. There's the Big Island. Now, yes, this is 5 days out, and they do have it becoming a Category 1 storm and then weakening again to a tropical storm, but it could bring a lot of rain to the Big Islands and really all the islands of Hawaii sometime the beginning of next week. I'm sure they're going to hope in Hawaii that this thing curves more to the north as Eric goes to the south, but right now Flossie is in that window of maybe being near the Big Island of Hawaii sometime on Monday. So let's check out the tropical activity map. I like looking at this because it puts things in perspective. We started out in June, very low, very low, very low. Here's where we sit as we move into August 1st, starting to, get a sharper angle, but you see what happens as we head towards September. So August is the transitioning month to get us to the peak in September, and we all have to be concerned about hurricanes starting to develop here in August. And other places that are concerned right now, our first guest this evening, I want to get him in here so I don't do all the yapping and talking. Here's a live look at Westport, Connecticut, because we think up in New England, hey, what do they have to worry about hurricanes? Well, we know from past history that they do. So about 45 minutes up the road, we find New Haven, Connecticut, and meteorologist Joe Fury. Now, Joe, the Northeast has fared its share of hurricanes over the years. How do folks react? How concerned do they get?
Bill, that's a very good question. Great to be here with you this evening. We here in southern New England, we get the storms and we've had our major problems, and we'll go through those in a moment. But in terms of what we've done as far as building along the shoreline, now we've gotten new measures in play. And the reason for that were the storms that occurred for us back in 2011 and 2012. You can see that we've gotten plenty of storms to come up at us, and some of the bigger ones that have affected us here in southern New England have come off that African coast and come right up off the coast of the Carolinas and right up into our backyard. And the most recent ones that affected us, and really a big concern for us in terms of what they did, because they were not hurricanes, they were tropical storms. We've had some 8 hurricanes to affect southern New England since 1904, about 17 tropical storms, and it was Sandy and Irene that were the 2 that got us in 2011 and 2012, 1 year apart, and they caused major problems, and they were not all that strong in terms of wind, but they still both managed to knock out power to over 750,000 people across the state of Connecticut alone. Some people without power for over a week, and the Connecticut shoreline was absolutely devastated. Many structures wiped away. So, yeah, you know, that's our big concern down the road, is that we see these tropical storms come in. They produce some pretty decent winds, some big waves on the shoreline, and we've had major destructions from these 2 storms. Of course, Sandy was unique in the fact that it came at the end of October, and it got pulled in by that strong northern branch jet flow. It was a very strong negative North Atlantic oscillation. It pulled it into the Jersey coast, and that, of course, was one that goes down in the history books, not only for its devastation from the wind and the rain and the power outages and so forth, but the big snows that were over there in West Virginia. All right, as far as going back a ways, it's a storm that certainly a lot of folks still talk about, and it's one that's really not, again, a major one. It was Hurricane Gloria, September 27th, 1985, pounding the Connecticut shoreline, but it came at the time of low tide. So the destruction along the shoreline, not all that big, 500,000 or so power outages around the state. It was, yes, a big problem for many, but it, again, occurred at a time of low tide. It went up through western Connecticut, and we recovered fairly quickly from that. Now, again, going back to, and of course we've talked about that here on Eye of the Storm, it's the inland flooding. And it was 2 storms, 2 hurricanes back in 1955, Hurricane Connie followed by Hurricane Diane. When they got up into southern New England, they weren't even classified as tropical storms anymore. It was all the leftover moisture from these 2 storms. August 12th and 13th, Connie came in with 4 to 6 inches, and then it was Diane on the 19th, dropping over a foot of rain across many parts of southern New England, and the epic historic floods across southern New England. There were some towns along the Housatonic and Farmington rivers in Connecticut that were just decimated, wiped out. So the floods of 55 are something that a lot of folks in Connecticut do remember, those that were around at this point in time. And it's probably the 2 storms that people will talk most about. 2 storms that people won't talk most about and they forget about were Edna and Carol, that were Cat 2 and Cat 3 hurricane that were back-to-back in 1954, just 1 year before. And so those are the 2 lost storms because they caused significant damage, but again, they're overshadowed by the big floods of 55. And then, of course, it's the big one, 1938, a storm that nobody knew was coming. It wasn't forecast. It's the hurricane of 1938. It came off the African coast on September the 9th. It arrived in Connecticut on the 21st of September, and it was just catastrophic. And again, a Cat 3 that came in, and this is the one that we're concerned about that's going to happen again at some point. And when it does, it's going to be just an awful, awful scene across all of New England. Let's take a look at some stats that were occurring from that storm of 1938. It was a storm that produced 186 mile per hour wind gusts, 17-foot storm surge that came in. Yeah, we're talking about 2 billion trees that were destroyed across New England, 700 deaths, cost of $628 million from that storm. That would be $50 billion today. And of course, bridges, utilities, railroads were absolutely wiped out. So when you talk about the big one, this is the one we talk about. This is the one that we worry is going to come back again and will come back again someday. Is it this year, next year, or still 40 years from now? We're not sure. But I will say one thing, Bill. When you look at things that are going on out in the Atlantic right now, where the central Atlantic ridge is, where we're talking about warmer than normal waters along the East Coast, of course, the very negative North Atlantic oscillation that's in play right now with the heat wave going on up there in Greenland, that North Atlantic oscillation in a strong negative phase, that usually makes for hurricanes and tropical storms a better chance to come up here as the trough comes up along the East Coast and couples with the ridge out to the east. And of course, Wes talked about this last week too, Bill. El Nino is fading. So
Right.
that's our shear shooter that would go out into the Atlantic and help knock the storms down, and that looks like it's going away as we head into the height of the hurricane and tropical storm season.
So it sounds like you've got a setup up in New England maybe that you're kind of worried a little bit about potential storms coming September, late August and September because of the way the North Atlantic oscillation is, and it sounds like it's almost like a funnel trying to come up to you or suck the, it doesn't suck the storms,
Exactly,
but bring
exactly
them right
right.
up
A funnel, indeed, because where the high is right now, it's in a classic spot. Storms coming off the African coast, which was talked about earlier this year that, hey, maybe it wasn't going to be much action happening. We're seeing it already, but when I see this strong negative NAO, and it's been in a negative phase since the 1st of May, so it seems like we're in a trend. Matter of fact, it's going as negative as it's been all year long right now. If it stays that way in combination with the warmer than normal water temperatures along the East Coast. See those water temperatures, Bill, off the coast of Florida, 90 in the low 90s right now. So, yeah, I think this year the East Coast is going to be under the gun for perhaps at least a couple, if not more, hurricanes and tropical storms.
All right, one last question with you, Joe, just to put it in perspective for folks watching elsewhere. You know, you talked about the big storm in the 30s and 50s. Do you worry about, and I know you had Sandy, but you say the big one was back then and you know there's going to be another big one. How do you deal with the folks that say, well, that's something to worry about down there. It's not going to happen to us again?
Yeah, yeah, Bill, no, what we do here at WTNH, you know, we get everybody together and we talk about the fact that what if this happens? What happens? What do we have to do? And so, you know, you have to be prepared. And we talk about that here on Eye of the Storm. It's being prepared, having a plan, knowing what are you going to do when the big storm comes along. So I think people have to keep that in mind, not just coastal residents, of course, but inland residents. Here in Connecticut, we're so heavily densely populated with the trees that you know, we saw with some tornadoes that went through here last year that, yeah, it's something that really gets us very nervous, and it's very chilling feel when you know that a storm like this is going to come along again someday, and folks are going to be like, wow, what happened?
Yeah, and so what Joe is saying, too, is nowhere, I mean, you always think Florida and such, but all the way up to New England and into Maine, there is that possibility of that storm. So thank you very much, Joe. Thanks for joining us in New Haven, Connecticut tonight. Hey, once again, Joe was mentioning about the October Sandy, and you can see how this storm, we finished with this graphic, peaks, but then it really drops off. Then there's this little secondary surge in the middle of October, and that's not just from Sandy. This is just historic. There's that little peak, then it falls off like a rock. But the Sandy occurred a little right on the downward trend, and so they're ready, have to be ready all the way through October. The season does go through November. So we're going to change subjects just a bit as we get ready to go to Johnson City, Tennessee. But I want to talk a little bit about Category 5 hurricanes, because these are the ones that have struck across the United States, including Michael last year and Andrew in '92 and the Florida Keys 1930s hurricane. The interesting thing about these Category 5 hurricanes is they were tropical storms, and they just really intensified quickly. We've been noticing that pattern and wondering, is it global warming? What is going on? Why are these storms intensifying so much? But they go all the way back into the 30s and 20s, and they were doing the same thing like that Florida Keys hurricane. So you can see where the Category 5 storms have struck, including Camille in 1969. It was only 65-mile-per-hour winds 3 days before. Then it made it up to 160 and devastated along the Alabama coast. Michael last year was 50 miles per hour. I remember this 3 days before. We're like, okay, well, it's coming up. And then it really blew up. And they categorized it as a Category 5 storm when it came across on Panama City. And then there's that Labor Day Florida Keys hurricane, 185 miles per hour winds, but it was only 43 days before. So we got to be on the lookout when we track these storms this year, that even though they might not be strong 3 days out, there's that potential, especially like Andrew, that was only 50 miles and 165 miles when it landed in 1992. And Joe was talking about he's worried about the pattern this year and how that could lead to more storms. Well, let me just show you here. This is 1992. The pattern wasn't conducive for a lot of storms. There weren't hardly any storms, but there was Hurricane Andrew. So if you talk to folks in South Florida, you're like, that was a terrible year. But in reality, climatologically, it wasn't a bad year at all in number of storms, okay? And we'll contrast that, and you can see that Andrew came through there as a Category 5 storm. So that made it devastating for the folks in South Florida. Look at this year, just for a contrast. 2010, you're like, oh my, tons of storms, but none of them hit the United States. So 2010, with many more storms than 1992, was a lot better year for us than 92 because we had Andrew. It just puts it in perspective when we worry about the number of storms. The ones that stay out in the middle of the Atlantic, although this one surrounded Bermuda, are harmless to us, but they do affect a lot of the areas when they come ashore. We did have a couple little tropical systems come ashore, but in 2010, no hurricanes made landfall in the United States. I don't know if we're going to be that lucky this year. We've had many hurricanes move inland, and inland effects are really important, as we know from Florence last year. So we're going to take a live look at a place that has a little bit of different experience with hurricanes, Johnson City, Tennessee, but they've had experience. WJHL Chief Meteorologist Mark Reynolds joins us now. And Mark, we talked last week in Roanoke, Virginia about inland flooding, and you guys obviously have something we have here along the don't have here along the North Carolina coast. Talk to me more about your experience with hurricanes and their effects in the mountains.
Yeah, I've been here a long time, going in on 35 years now, Bill, and we've seen quite a bit of tropical development that we have to watch very carefully, not only that hits the Gulf of Mexico, but also that comes into the southeast. I want to first of all tell the viewers out there who are watching where we're located at, right here in northeast Tennessee. We call it the Tri-City area, and that encompasses East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia. So Johnson City, Bristol, Kingsport, you might have heard of BMS, Bristol Motor Speedway. That's the area we're in. Beautiful part of the country, a lot of mountains in the region as well. I want to talk, though, about some of the landfalling storms. Once they made landfall, what effect they had on our region. We'll first of all talk about Hurricane Hugo back in 1989. As that hurricane came ashore, we all know what happened there in Charleston, South Carolina. You see the damage here. And as that storm moved inland, one of the biggest problems we had, places like Charlotte, North Carolina, 90-mile-per-hour winds. We had some of that. I remember that evening very well. That storm came barreling towards Charlotte. A lot of power outages. Look what it also did for our neighbors in Caldwell County, North Carolina, just over the state line, western North Carolina, trees down, numerous trees down, power outages that lasted for 3 weeks there. And then Hugo, as it moved farther inland, it moved right over our mountain zones early that morning, producing winds in excess of 60 miles per hour over the higher terrain. Boone, North Carolina, close to 7 inches of rain there. And naturally, Hugo moved on northward very quickly. What's interesting about this storm, though, as it came over our region, we didn't have the technology we have now. So a lot of people were worried about the storm. Our Weather Service office that did the forecast for the state was in Memphis, and now we've had the modernization of the National Weather Service. But because it was in Memphis, some of the people locally, not television, just called to see what the storm was doing. And we actually had schools let out early that day, even though the storm was well up into Pennsylvania. So thank goodness for technology that we've seen. I want to highlight, though, some of the rainfall totals here. And look over the western North Carolina mountains. This is our biggest concern when we see these landfalling systems. They bring a tremendous amount of rainfall into the mountain zones, and that can cause quite a bit of flooding. We saw that with Hugo. And now we're going to concentrate our effects on Ivan. You remember Ivan in 2004? That was quite a storm that moved inland as well, moved inland to Mississippi, Alabama, the Florida Panhandle, winds of 120. But watch what happens as that storm moved inland. It became a tropical depression. We had numerous tornadoes, as you know there, Bill, in your area, the Mid-Atlantic. Look at Virginia, 38 tornadoes, total tornadoes from the Gulf Coast to Pennsylvania, 118 tornadoes. And again, the largest one-day total for Virginia alone. And that's another concern we have. When these storms come inland, we oftentimes could see that rotation. We see these tornado spin-ups very quickly through the Tennessee Valley into parts of Virginia. But look at Ivan's rainfall here. I want to close in on that because as you look at that map, parts of western North Carolina, Haywood County, up to 17 inches of rain. And look at Black Mountain. That's just outside of Asheville, close to 12 inches of rain there. Blue Rock, North Carolina, Yancey County. So many of the areas here, 5 to a foot of rainfall, 5 inches to a foot of rainfall. And that definitely caused localized flooding. Want to zoom in on Macon County, southwestern North Carolina. Look at this on Thursday, September 16th. We had 12 inches of rain in 2 days. That caused what we term as a massive debris flow. Unfortunately, that debris flow started at the blue arrow there, came all the way down the mountain, had 15 homes destroyed, 4 fatalities, and you could see the effects of that. That's our big concern here in the mountain territory where we have these enormous amounts of rainfall and the soil doesn't like that too well, so we see these landslides and mudslides as well. And also, I want to talk real quickly about Hurricane Camille. This is quite a storm. If you like to do history research, look at this. We're going to zoom in on Nelson County in Virginia. Look at this amount of rainfall, 27 inches of rain in an 8-hour period. Yes, it's still inland, still the effects of Camille as it moved inland. And what happened, that rain moved perpendicular to the mountains. We had tremendous amounts of rain in such a short period of time. I read one farmer had 31 inches of rainfall there. And once again with this, look at that rain. We had a mudslide again with that, unfortunately causing quite a bit of fatalities, 150 to 160 fatalities. And here's what I want to highlight. In the mountains, we have what we term as upslope winds. So when these storms come inland, say it comes into the Carolinas, low pressure, counterclockwise circulation, we see an upslope wind on the mountains in North Carolina, and that just deposits tremendous amount of rainfall. And you can see a better idea here. Look how the clouds just form there, and that moisture kind of gets squeezed out like a sponge. You think of a sponge, it can only hold so much moisture. We see that squeeze effect. The sponge is just squeezed out, tremendous amounts of moisture there, and that's what happens. So the upslope on the Carolina side, downslope on the East Tennessee side, and that, Bill, is our big concern with landfalling storms and tropical systems that do affect the Appalachian Mountains.
Yeah, so what you're telling us then is when the storms come in, you've got the moisture from the tropical system, but then because of the topography, you've got that uplift. So are you telling me that chances are the rain's always going to be heavier on the North Carolina side than the Tennessee side?
For the most part, they are, because once the storm comes inland, it usually has a turn effect where it goes into the Carolinas. But sometimes even Katrina caused flooding in parts of West Tennessee. It really determines the track of that storm, where it goes to. And I like the comments earlier. You guys were talking with Sandy. I don't know if you remember, Sandy. We were watching that very carefully because all of our forecast models with that superstorm Sandy actually showed snow, and we got the snow on the backside of that. So interesting effects here. With the mountains, we always like to say the mountains love to hold that moisture. So even though the storm may be gone, we keep that moisture, we keep the rain, and our other big concern could be fronts too that stall out with the tremendous.
Yeah, how does that work when you guys see a front that kind of stalls out? Like we're going to get a front here come this weekend, and it's going to stall out because it's summer. So if you get the low pressure system and the front together just kind of hanging out, what happens up there?
Yeah, that's like a disaster in the making, because that front kind of lays across the Tennessee Valley. You got low pressure causing the air to lift, so we just wring out the atmosphere. And because of the nature, the fronts like to stall, that low pressure just sits here and slowly, and I mean sometimes slowly, moves east and northeast. And again, that could create a tremendous amount of rain for our region.
Well, I know you, Mark, you live in a beautiful area. Congratulations on 35, 36 years up there. But Tri-Cities, you were showing where they were. You know what I can't get out of my mind when we talk Tri-Cities is the Darius Rucker Wagon Wheel song, heading to Johnson City, Tennessee. Do you know the song I'm talking about?
I've heard that song, yes, indeed.
That's what's not going to be on your head now.
A lot of people like to come here.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, a lot of people like to come here for vacation. Just a gorgeous area.
Yeah, all right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you for joining us for tonight's Eye on the Storm. Don't forget, we'll be here every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock throughout the Atlantic hurricane season. Wes will be back next week. And thanks for spending part of your night with us. Live in Raleigh, North Carolina, I'm meteorologist Bill Ray. Good night.